All right. Good morning. Good afternoon. It's afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I'm Wendy Goldberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Tri-Faith Initiative. And this morning, I'm going to practice what I preach. And that is, I wrote a statement a couple of months back saying that our work is not always to agree, but to rather learn how to listen deeply, to unite widely, and to act boldly. And I think in order to do that, I need to invite conversations that are courageous and that are opening myself in new ways. And so I'm going to practice doing that today and model that in front of all of you. It might be a little less interactive than some of the conversations that we've had, but Naser and I have worked up to this moment. We've been in relationship with each other for 15 years. Some days have been more joyous than others, and we're going to talk really openly about that experience today. I thought it felt to me as to help you understand that I'm here today to listen. I'm not here to debate with Naser. I'm not here to challenge Naser. I'm here today to hear and acknowledge Naser as a full human being who has a passion and thoughts and beautiful history. And I want to come to learn and know about that more deeply in front of all of you. And my goal is to seek to understand. And so in that, I was centering myself before this, and I was able to revise a prayer that I read from a book called Honoring Voice, and I'd like to read it to you. It's a prayer about honoring courage. Thank you for this day to question everything. Inspire me to quench my thirst for knowledge and answers. Expose me to the teachers who engage my mind and explain to me how we are all connected. Sign me up for the course of life with the sole purpose of marveling at the wonders of the world. Strengthen me as a student of the extraordinary. Help me look behind the curtain and glimpse new worlds. Activate my imagination so I may realize and rescue treasure when I find it. Open my mind and develop my fascination with inquiry. Help me observe and look more deeply. Show me colors, beauty, and let me be willing to dig deeply with self-forging tools in order that I may know others in a sacred way. Support my inklings to help me follow my intuition to new frontiers. Aid me in experiencing the joy that comes from removing passivity. Strengthen my muscles for scouting and rooting, and catch me when I fall and set me upright again. With that and a deep breath, Naser, thank you for joining me today in this call. I'm so grateful that you said yes. Let's start. I also want to tell everyone, this isn't a cold call. Naser and I had a series of phone calls and email exchanges to make sure that we knew what we were going to talk about here today. We have a set of questions, and Naser has prepared some things to share with us and spent a great deal of time thinking about this with me. And so it's with so much gratitude that I invite you to this Tri-Faith conversation with me. Let's start. You are an American Muslim of Palestinian ancestry. Please tell us about that heritage.
Well, Wendy, thank you very much again for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to the Tri-Faith community and others that have joined us today. Thank you for the work you do. I know I'm no longer on the board and so on, but the work of the Tri-Faith is something that I strongly believe in. And the activities that you've been doing have been wonderful. And I attended quite a few of them informative, educational, inspiring, all aspects of really what you would like to see in terms of the work of the Tri-Faith. As you mentioned, thank you for giving me the opportunity to at least have a feel for where we're going with this. So I appreciate that, and I hope you bear with me. I am an educator, but I use PowerPoints to really support what we're talking about. So when I'm asked about being an American, a Palestinian, and so on, and the heritage, I mean, the heritage is everything of who we are. So it's an integral part of our identity, our legacy. If we don't honor it, cherish it, if we don't nurture it, and that goes throughout of our lifespan, certainly we're going to lose hope who we are. So our identity is important. It is what's going to help us to establish a legacy. For me, I'm a very proud American. It's been a wonderful kind of thing for us to come to the United States. As Palestinians, sadly, we did not have the opportunity. I wanted to study medicine. We were in Kuwait. I did very well, but sadly, I was not able to be accepted. So my parents, thank God, were willing to send us overseas. And here we are about 36 years later. So God bless them for giving us that opportunity. And I am a proud American. I believe in the beautiful principles this country was built on, and we feel fortunate that we were able to be here. In terms of being a Muslim, certainly Islam and its teaching, it resonates in all aspects, really, of my existence. I'm a husband, a father, a son, a brother, a professor, soccer coach. Everybody knows my passion about soccer, a neighbor, and certainly as an activist, not only for Palestine, for all kinds of causes. And even as a Muslim, I would say I did not speak as a Muslim before 9/11, but afterwards, I felt very compelled to speak as a Muslim. In terms of Palestine, Palestine has always been in our heart. I admire the Jewish people when they say we waited 2,000 years to go back to our homeland. Well, we Palestinians, it's only been 73 years. So for us, whether it's sadly our great-grandparents, grandparents who became refugees in 1948, and in 1967, my parents and us became refugees. We were young children at that time, but the memory of Palestine has been instilled in us and will always be. I was very fortunate to return several times to Palestine. I taught at several universities. I went there with my mom, and went there with my wife, and so on. My brother has been there. It is disheartening to go back there, and it feels kind of odd to be able to go back there as an American, but I cannot go there as a Palestinian, but that's important. I think the key thing in terms of my identity, whether as an American or Arab or Muslim or Palestinian, our loyalty as Americans is always being questioned. As an Arab, Muslim, Palestinian, you put them all together, that's the three whammies in a sense. If you add being a male also, an Arab male, So we strongly believe that our identity has been distorted, stereotyped, dehumanized, and demonized, and certainly put under suspicion. And in the case of the United States, and sadly, even in Omaha, Islamophobia, Arabophobia, it has a strong foothold with an industry that is worth millions of dollars and so on. So that is something we always feel we have to combat. And again, for me, a person that really made a huge, and do you see my slides?
Yes.
Just want to make sure. Professor Jack Shaheen, we brought him twice here to Omaha. Sadly, he passed away 2 years ago, did amazing work about the stereotyping of the other, but he did a lot of work about Arabs. And I would encourage people, not only because he talked about Arabs and Muslims and so on, but he really addressed stereotyping of the other in general. Professor Edward Said is a well-known thinker and so on. He passed away also, but he did the work on Orientalism. And I think anybody that needs to understand how the West deals with the other, especially the Orient and Arabs and Muslims and so on, that work is so critical, so important to get a perspective in terms of how Arabs, Muslims, and people in the Far East are being portrayed. So hopefully that answers your first question.
Thank you. My next question that I bet lots of people are asking is, why did you say yes to my invitation?
I mean, the thing really in terms of that, and I'll get that to it, I want to kind of to start with, if you really want to know people, how do you really know them? Certainly by sharing food with them, certainly by going to their homes and so on. And for me, part of that answer to that question is knowing who Naser is. Sadly, for many in the community here, Naser is the one that writes editorials about Palestine and Israel. For me, it's about my family. This is my mom and dad when they got married. This is my grandfather, mom's father, who was a well-known merchant in Palestine and lost everything, sadly, after the establishment of the state of Israel. This is in the 1950s, my mom, grandmother, my granddad, and so on. So I think the reason I wanted to do this, it's part of the history. And that's parts of really what we discussed in the first question. This is my wife when she was 3 years old with her mom. This is her dad before he left Palestine. That's Linda when she was young. That's my dad with my older brother and neighbor. This is all in Palestine. This is me right here. Cannot believe I had hairdo that is similar to what kids do now. And this is at a Catholic school. We happen to be Muslims, but we were taught in Catholic schools and so on. This is my whole family from my dad's side. This is my dad, my mom. Sadly, our older brother died when he was young. Uncles, aunts, my grandfather, who sadly died in Kuwait and still remembering his life in Palestine. This is my mom when she was pregnant and me, and so on. And this is the three brothers, and that's me right here. I don't know, that smile looks very suspicious and so on. But in any case, this is my brother who passed away. This is my father with his friends and cousin in Palestine. This is Linda's great-grandmother and mother, and this is Linda. And she died at the age of 95, and everything she talked about is, can I go back to Palestine? So this is me at the wedding of my uncle. This is my dad at the wedding. So this is us here at the graduation of my daughter. Food, again, we've had so many people, even many in the tri-faith and so on. So food is a major part. If you go to Jerusalem, this is the bread that is made in Jerusalem, and amazing. And my wife is an excellent cook, and she made that. That's why it makes full. Stir fry is major for us, and I love it. It's healthy and so on. So we take time. This is spinach, and this is مسخن. So again, this is my daughter for her graduation, Thanksgiving meals, family, graduation of my wife with a social work degree, family of Linda they immigrated to Canada and so on. This is another for our Eid celebration with my brother and his family. This is celebrating my mom's 80th kind of birthday with the kids, my brother and his family. So the reason I show these, again, I think we all need to understand that whether it's Muslims or Christians or Jews, we share same values about family, about friends, about neighbors, and about who we are and so on. Same thing with Islam as a religion and so on. So very, very important in terms of as a soccer coach. And I love that we're going to Kansas City for a soccer tournament tomorrow. So we are all the same. We share the same things. You know, this is my brother, my son, and I'm a Liverpool supporter. I'm a Jeepster too. So again, why we do this? Because we want to humanize each other. We want to learn about each other. So it's really important. And Muslims, Arabs, and so on, they resemble the same struggles, aspiration, and day-to-day experience in any other part of the world. And yes, here in Omaha, and my family an example of other Muslims, other Arabs who are Muslims and Christians. Many of the Arabs in this community are also Christians, and they are not as acknowledged as a part of that part of the world. So we really are a part of the community. And when I talk about cultural sensitivity, it is really about sensitizing each other to who we are and so on. So why did I accept? Well, you look at the Tri-Faith, you look at the American Institute, you look at Temple Israel, and you look at Countryside. The key words are in there. Why they embarked on this journey, why they wanted to be part of this journey. Equality, acceptance, loving the other. That is so important. That was important for me for 5 years. That to accept, it wasn't an easy decision. I shared that with you and so on. I invested 5 years of my life, my family did. Sadly, my experience leaving the Tri-Faith was not a good one. It seemed like Naser came down, and many Arabs and Muslims, they come down to sound bites. What are those sound bites? Do you accept or support the right of Israel to exist? That's not what the Tri-Faith is about. Do you support Hamas? Do you support terrorism? Sadly, that's what I was exposed to, working diligently with my family for 5 years. And regardless of anything we did, the bottom line is, do you accept the right of the state of Israel to exist? Because I write editorial about the right of Palestinians to exist, the right of Palestine to exist. It doesn't mean that I'm denying the right of Israel, and we'll talk about that more. But it is accepting the other for who he is. And there has been sadly many things in terms of whether it's the board, members of the board, not really being sensitized to what I do as a member of the board to kind of, and I'm not going to talk about all that history and being called anti-Semite and being called a supporter of terrorism and letters to my dean, the president of Creighton University. Those did not really help in many ways, and there were many other examples. So why did I accept? Again, because we need to humanize each other. As an American, as a father, as an uncle, I want people to see who I am, and I want to see the similarities that we have and so on. And we all want a better future for our children. Rabbi, Tim Anderson, everybody that was embarking on this, we all talked about the future generation. It's not about Naser, it's not about the Rabbi, Ariel, and so on. It was about the future generation. So that's why I felt it's important. I don't speak for the Muslim community. I would never claim to be speaking for the Muslim community, but I'm being very proud of who I am. And I don't feel we as Muslims need to apologize for who we are or being defensive. So I accepted as a Muslim to speak frankly who we are as Muslims, not that I speak in terms of all Muslims and so on. And of course, as a Palestinian, yes, my narrative is different. It's biased, no doubt about it. But people need to hear that, because if you want to understand the other, I read Israeli newspapers, I watch Israeli news to really understand. I watch Fox News to understand how others think. So we need to kind of think about our blind spots and think about others. And in terms of being an educator, I teach about cultural competency and sensitivity. Yes, we need to think about the other in different ways and how our blind spots. And in terms of the Tri-Faith Initiative, again, I am in strong support of that. And I believe its essence of acceptance is so important. So that's why in all these aspects, that's why I accept it. And I respect you. I respect the work you did. Yes, we had our differences and so on, but definitely thank you for the opportunity. And I know it was a long answer, but I hope you understand why I accepted.
Thank you. I especially think Linda looks great in some of those pictures next to you. You should really celebrate her. She's she has been the strength behind you, I know, a lot of the time. And I want
Absolutely.
to acknowledge her role in this also, even though she's not on this call. I know that David has been the strength behind me, and I see that in you and Linda as well. She's shown up for a long time also. So thank you for including her family in those photos as well. So, you know, as you've said, you've been doing this for 30 years and you have had a personal passion to educate the people of Nebraska about the Arab and Muslim culture. You've said many of the pieces, but very specifically, what drives that ambition for you?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned David. I respect David a lot, and I've known him for quite a while. And absolutely, and talking about what we do in our communities and education and so on, and why do we have that ambition? It is family. You know, my dad was a man of conviction, always tried to do his best for his family, extended family, the whole community we lived in, whether it was in Palestine and afterwards in Kuwait. Very passionate, committed, and sincere, and so on. So he had a major impact. My mom sacrificed all her life, all her well-being, really, to serve us, to be there for us, support us, and for others. You mentioned Linda. Linda was a lawyer. God bless her. She went back to school. She became a social worker. Every day I listen to the work that they're doing at Heart Ministry Center, and that is really a big motivation for me in terms of the work that that community does for everybody in Omaha and so on. And certainly for my wife, she found her call in life, and I'm very happy for her. My brother Ayman has always been supportive. My children, extended family, even those that are in Palestine, in Jordan, all over and so on, have always been supportive. I love the work that my sister-in-law does. She's always advocated for kids with disabilities and so on. She's done a great job working across Nebraska. So these are people that inspired me, Nebraskans for Peace and the Task Force for Palestine. They've always kept their work going, and not only for Palestine, but all causes of justice. So there are many, many examples and so on of people. So, you know, ambition really is important, because with ambitions, you establish goals, you want to move forward, you have a purpose, you move with confidence and so on. And the key thing is you want to change the status quo. And you want to recognize there will be adversity and so on, but you will continue the struggle and so on. So absolutely, we need to do that. The key thing also to recognize, we need to focus on things that we can control and not to dwell on the negative. And that's something that helped me with continuing my ambition. The last thing in terms of ambition, yes, there has been a lot of disappointment. I mentioned my experience, sadly, with the Tri-Faith and how it all ended up being about the politics rather than the work we were all doing, including what Naser is doing. And sadly, even some in our community, whether bringing in the Arab community together or the Muslim community, many disappointments there, many disappointments. And that happens with every community. But the key thing is you continue the work that you're doing, even if you have to do it on your own. So that's really very critical, very important.
Thank you. For you, the tragic situation in Palestine is not complicated. It's about human rights, justice, and a call for people of faith and activism to take a stand for a just solution. Tell us more about that.
Thank you. Yes, Palestine and any issue, there's always going to be two sides to that story. We will all have our blind spots when it comes to an issue that is so heated, including Palestine and so on. So as a Palestinian, yes, I'm sure I have my own blind spot regarding Israel and so on, and my own biases. But as I mentioned earlier, trust me, I do read all kind of Israeli newspapers and news, and we have a satellite kind of box that we can watch news from all over the world. It is so important to understand the point of view of the others. And I've tried to make an effort throughout the years to really read about what Israelis, what Israel, and so on. That is very important, and so on. The Holy Land is close to the heart of the people of the monotheistic faith, no doubt about it. But for us as Palestinians, yes, it is a tragedy. We call it a Nakba, the catastrophe. And our narrative seems to always be the elephant in the room. When I was on the board, and Rabbi, God bless him, he always tried to bring it as a topic so that we agree to disagree, but we can move forward, but it didn't materialize and so on. Sadly, for some Zionists I call, and some in the Jewish community, they feel that narrative should never be heard. And that's where the problem is. So when I say it's a simple thing, it is a simple thing. For us as Palestinians, for hundreds of millions around the world, it is a tragic situation, but it is a simple. Why I say it's a simple? First and most, for us, we feel it's a colonial kind of endeavor that happened by secular Zionist movement. And that movement, with the support of, we have to talk about that history, and the narrative from our biased perspective is how it started. And again, it started by a Zionist movement with the ideology to establish a land, a Jewish homeland and they looked at different places in the world, and it ended up being Palestine. So Palestine wasn't even the first choice. In fact, it's ironic, this week commemorates the 104 years since the Balfour Declaration. And that's where the Zionist movement, with the support of the British government, which had colonial control over Palestine, they gave the infamous declaration to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine and so on. The key thing when I say that, I don't take that lightly. Israel has accomplished great things since its establishment, no doubt about it. But at the same time, that history is important. So when I speak about colonization and the establishment of the state of Israel, I speak about what is common with colonization. The two common things, first is dehumanization. Every colonial power, that's what they do. That's what they do. They dehumanize. Sadly, Golda Meir, a very prominent figure in terms of Israel history and so on, when she says no such thing as Palestinians exist, that is leading to like, well, they don't exist, then we can do whatever we want. Or a land without people, for a people without a land. Those pictures of my great-grandparents, grandparents, and parents, they lived a prosperous life in Palestine. So when you say a land without people, for a people without the land, those sound bites, sadly, that's what resonates with many that support Israel. She also said, the old will die and the young will forget. Well, God bless the Jewish people. They waited 2,000 years to go back to their homeland. And again, for one of the people that established the state of Israel, to say these kind of words, it lends itself to what colonial powers do. Sadly, that's what we did with the Native Americans. The words that, sadly, I go to high schools and we talk about issues of isms and racism and faithism and so on. When I ask about the Native Americans, the words that even from kids that come now, barbaric, savages, uncivilized, horrific to think about the natives in those, but that's what's common, sadly, and so on. More recently, the sound bites are, there is no partner for peace. Many offers that the Palestinians refuse. We gave them Gaza and they sent us rockets, sound bites. They don't talk about the reality of what's happening, the brutality of the occupation. So these sound bites matter. The Israeli government have mastered those. And sadly, our politicians, they buy those and they use them again and again and again. And the history and what happened to the Palestinians no longer matter. Second part of that story, of course, is the demonization. We're all terrorists. We're all, willing to give our children to kind of get media points and so on. We use our women and children as human shields. So we're barbaric and civilized like all our mates. That's really sadly. And the media bites that immediately. In fact, my first activism in this town in 1991, maybe earlier, we collected everything that the Omaha World Herald writes about Arabs, Muslims, Palestine. For a year and a half, we cut them and we showed them. There was not a single positive story about the Arab countries, Muslim countries, Palestinians. The pictures that are being used are only negative, violent pictures and so on. So in many ways, it's perpetuating the same stereotypes. Sadly, they will say Palestinians par as Israel retaliates. And then when you read the article, 5 Palestinians were shot by Israeli soldiers. So very sad, again, in terms of the coverage and so on. So this did not happen in the vacuum. Again, if you read the history from Jack Shaheen and his work is amazing in terms of Hollywood, TV, radio, he really put that out there in terms of why a lot of the stereotypes, misconceptions about Arabs and Muslims and so on. It's kind of one of the things he said, the portrayal is always about the 3 Bs. And if we have time, I would have asked you to write in the chat and so on and wait for an answer. But he said the Arabs and Muslims are either billionaires, bombers, or they are belly dancers. That's what they are in movies. Jewish people have been exposed to this. In fact, Jack Shaheen, when he came, I told him, I want you to shock the audience. One of the cartoons that he brought, it showed a rabbi with the $ in his eyes. That's how they portrayed Jewish people in the 1960s. He showed a horrific thing about African Americans. And what he showed is a cartoon with 2 monkeys, an African-American little kid in the middle. The music plays. And when the music plays, the monkeys, they start dancing. And the African-American kid looks at one monkey and the other and kind of confused what to do. And then the African-American kid starts imitating the monkey. So the message, sadly, for these little kids watching in the 1960s and so on, is the African-American kid is even less sadly than a monkey. So portrayers, Hollywood and the media, that's a whole lecture by itself, portrayal of different groups, is horrific. So when we demonize, sadly, that's not going to help in any way, whether it's Arabs, Muslims, refugees, immigrants, you name it, Jews, Catholics originally, and so on, the mafioso image and all that stuff. So the goal is always to justify the wrong of what happened and deny the natives their rights and humanity. The second part is, of course, human rights, and human rights for everybody in Palestine, including Palestinian Muslims and Christians that are denied every aspect of their rights, whether it's the right to education, it's the right for free movement, it's the right for health, it's the right to raise a family, the right to protest without being shot at, religious rights to visit, whether it's the Al-Aqsa Mosque or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I was there at the invitation of the Bishop of the Episcopal Church, we brought here for 10 days. We were in Bethlehem and people were hugging and kissing. And I wasn't sure at one church what's going on. And he shared, they're just so excited because they got their permit to go and visit the holy city. It is so difficult for Palestinians and Christians and Muslims to visit their holy sites. And sometimes they're subjugated to all kinds of violence when they visit and so on. So that right is being denied. More recently, Israel, and many maybe have heard that, some of the top civil rights groups in Palestine advocating for women's rights, farmers' rights, political prisoners, children who are in prison and so on, all of those were designated as terrorist organizations. And the whole world was it's like, how could you do this? Sadly, our State Department did not even utter a single word, and so on. So very, very unfortunate. Sadly, just recently, now Palestinian right to be buried in peace is being denied. A cemetery in Al Yusufiyah village is targeted so that a park will be buried. And this is a woman holding the tomb of her son that will be excavated so that the park will be built there. So many rights have been sadly denied and so on. And that is an important one. And the last right, of course, the right of the Palestinian refugees, now 70 million at that, their right to go back. The last aspect, of course, is justice. People ask about what is justice in this case. For me, it is about correcting the wrong that happened in 1948 and before 1948. When I was on the board of the Tri-Faith, I know the Zionist Organization of America came and they wanted Temple to be not part of this whole discussion about the Tri-Faith initiative. When that failed, then the pressure came that the Tri-Faith needs to accept the right of the State of Israel to exist as a Jewish state and to denounce terrorism. When the ex-president of the Tri-Faith came to the board meeting and said that, I just like, whoa, is this the journey that I embarked on for 5 years? Is this what the Tri-Faith is all about? So that was really shocking to me that this kind of issue would be brought up and then being targeted that I need to accept the State of Israel and so on, and my board to be accepting that. And sadly, that's when I resigned. So for me, in terms of justice, for Israel to exist, it has to accept its moral and legal responsibility for what happened in 1948. People thought that the Oslo Accord will guarantee that. Many of us Palestinians, we knew sadly that's not going to happen. That's when we talked about the two-state solution. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. When you talk about what is being built, the apartheid wall, that is not going to happen. If you look at what's happening in Palestine, the Jewish people only owned barely 3% of the land at the beginning of the century, barely about 10% at the time of, excuse me, of the division of Palestine. Of course, this is in 1967. And now there is no such thing as Palestine. I mean, you're talking about, a Swiss cheese. Everybody heard that term, and it's not going to happen. And, so when we talk about no partner for peace, the soundbite, look at the reality on the ground. Look what happened after the Oslo Accord. More than 600,000 Israeli settlers, sadly, many of them are the extremist elements of the Jewish communities from around the world coming in to settle there. They don't even believe the Palestinians exist, and now they're here. They have their own Jewish roads and so on. They cannot really, I don't know how we're gonna have a two-state solution, sadly, with what happened on the ground. So Israel doesn't believe, of course, it seems like, in a two-state solution. Obviously, a one-state solution is not going to happen. So what Israel is doing is creating reality on the ground. That's what Netanyahu discussed in 1974. That's what Ben-Gurion discussed in 1948. Sadly, it's creating more and more reality, not only in Palestine, but in the Golan Heights, in South Lebanon. And you can look at the diaries of a lot of the Israeli leaders and their goals as Zionists, because many Jews still around the world do not support, what is happening in Palestine. So I cannot say that. So unfortunately, in terms of justice, what's happening in Jerusalem, we're talking about 22,800 Palestinians in East Jerusalem. Already 60 homes have been taken by Jewish settlers from somewhere in the world claiming that's their homes. 500 are under the threat of forced eviction. Many of you might have heard Sheikh Jarrah, which is a prominent Palestinian area in East Jerusalem. 27 Palestinian families are being kicked out of their homes. Many of them are living in tents across the street from their homes. The other things Israel is doing, sadly, is revocation of residency status of people in East Jerusalem. Anybody that goes to education in outside Palestine and so on, and they want to come back to Jerusalem, if they are out for 6 months, they're no longer a resident of Jerusalem. Any Jewish person lives in those areas can go, come back, but they're trying to get rid of as many Palestinian Muslims and Christians that live there. Building permits, they're not allowing Palestinians to build. Many of us don't recognize the Oslo Accord did not give Palestinians autonomy. They gave autonomy in what they call Area A, which is the major Palestinian cities. Area B has control by Israeli security forces and some control by the Palestinians. Area C is 60% of the West Bank, full control by Israel. Palestinians cannot build on that land. If they build, they will be demolished. If they need a permit, it could take 5-6 years. So when people talk about an apartheid system, sadly, that is what's being done in Palestine. On top of that, it's all these Israeli settlements that are being built and hundreds of outposts. What's an outpost? An Israeli settlement will be here. They establish an outpost here. That means that settlement can expand all the way to the outpost. That land belongs to the Palestinian village next to it. The Palestinians cannot build, they cannot farm their land. So the system that is existing, sadly, is creating more and more reality on the ground. So really, I will go back to say, if anything is going to happen in Palestine, we have to really address the reality on the ground, because Israel is creating more and more reality that is making it more and more difficult. That's why the Palestinian civil rights groups, NGOs, called for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. And that's why it's a peaceful movement. Many people target it as anti-Semite. I've been targeted because I support that, because I believe that's the only way really you can put on Israel on pressure in terms of potentially preventing what's happening, which might be irreversible. And that's what really made apartheid South Africa negotiate with Afrikaners and ultimately destroy that apartheid system. And many organizations in this country and around the world, including Amazon and Google and so on, trying to really do this boycott and preventing technology from getting to Israel and so on. So again, I know it's a long answer. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. But really, what we need in Palestine for people of conscience, people of faith, to really talk about the elephant in the room. And that elephant in the room is the Palestinian people deserve to be free. Palestine should exist. And everything Israel is doing, sadly, makes it impossible. So we need to speak the truth about Palestine, have the courage to talk about the other narratives. And I would even say Jewish Americans, with their history of fighting for rights in Israel, in this country, in all aspects of our fabrics, I hope there will be more and more speaking out for justice in Palestine, for human rights, and so on, so that really they really honor their history of fighting for justice, because that's what Judaism is all about, and to get rid of some of their blind spots when it comes to Palestine and Palestinians.
Thank you. Since our early conversations about this meetup today, you have talked about reconciliation for the people of the Holy Land. Can you tell us what that looks like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think kind of mentioned that. I think many people were hoping the Oslo Accord was about reconciliation, but the writing, we're there all the time, that sadly it's about creating more realities on the ground. So I think for reconciliation, I will repeat what I said. Israel has to really accept its moral and legal responsibility to what happened in 1948. That is so critical. And I think for many Palestinians, that acknowledgement will kind of all these issues, Jerusalem, refugees, then will become much easier to deal with that acknowledgement. I know it is hard. I know it's not an easy thing to say, but that is a must. That is a must. And we cannot continue with this hasbara about what happened in 1948 and before 1948, and the Israeli Foreign Ministry putting millions and billions of dollars to fight the other narrative. Israeli historians, God bless them, have documented that history, and many of them have acknowledged. Rabbi, God bless him, in our discussion, yes, we agreed to disagree on many things. I will mention a story real quick. You know, I used to go to Westside High School a lot to speak about Palestine, Israel. I know Bob Wolfson is back in town. We're going to have lunch next week, but we've always agreed to disagree after many years. And one time with another Jewish presenter who completely denied our existence as Palestinians and so on, and he was really venomous in his attacks. And at the end, I said something, and I said, I'm not trying to be insensitive, that the establishment of the state of Israel is our Holocaust. And I know that brings so much horrific history for the Jewish people, but I said it to really drive the point. And after the presentation, this elderly gentleman came from upstairs in the balcony, came and introduced himself. And you might know him, and I'm sure Rabbi knows him, Sam Freed. And he introduced himself and he said about his history, but God bless him. He said, Naser, I know why you said what you said. And that statement resonates in me from somebody who went through the Holocaust. And for him, after me saying that statement as a Palestinian, and for him to say, I understand why you said what you said, it brings shivers in my body even now, many years later. We became good friends. We went to lunch at the French Cafe at that time, and we became good friends, and God bless him. He did share with me what he did after he became successful. And I saw that at Temple Israel on 72nd, where he had that light that flickers 6 million times. And I believe he did that at many synagogues around the country. For that experience, that's why I feel there is hope, because that acknowledgement, even though as painful as it might have been for somebody who is Jewish, whose family perished in the Holocaust, for a Palestinian to say what he said and to come to me and say, Naser, I know and understand why you said what you said. Wow. So God willing, I mean, I don't see any other way, especially with the reality on the ground. Sadly, with the Trump administration, what it did and the damage it's did, there has to be a way for Israel to acknowledge its history. That's the only way for reconciliation. Other than that, we're going to see more realities on the ground. And sadly, when Palestinians revolt, or God forbid, when Gaza just gets to the break and they start firing rockets, then the narrative is Hamas is firing rockets rather than the siege of Gaza that is making children die from malnutrition and for calculating how many calories go in Gaza. Not acceptable. We cannot continue the status quo. Absolutely not. And for me, I think reconciliation starts with Israel.
Thank you. I'm going to skip over a couple of our questions about identity and move straight to the conversation that we wanted to have, because we have 10 minutes left, about the model and framework that you teach to help move people beyond tolerance.
Absolutely. I've been very fortunate with cultural competency and teaching about cultural competency, very, very important work. And I've done many workshops and so on around the country at Creighton, internationally in many countries, because sadly, discrimination, bias, implicit bias, explicit bias exists across all nationalities, ethnicities, and so on. Very, very important. I don't know how many of you know James Byrd, but that was one of the most horrific stories I heard about violence against African Americans in this country. That was when I participated in the National Conference for Christians and Jews in many of their camps. Jane Bath was the director at that time, and he was driven for 3 miles behind a truck with 3 white supremacists, till ultimately, sadly, his head was severed. And they continued driving for almost miles after that. And they dumped him between the cemetery, between the white cemetery and the African-American cemetery in that town in Texas. Very sad history and so on, very sad history. And I could go on any of the things that contributed for me to really consider talking about culture and cultural competency and framework for us to really coexist and appreciate and recognize the other. Many of you know about the iceberg exercise, and for us to need to dig deeper so that we recognize the other and acknowledge the other. The key thing with really a framework, you need to understand where you are in terms of the cultural continuum. Sadly, many of us might be at the cultural destructive when we look at the other in terms of all aspects, whether it's gender, mental ability, religion, you name it, politics, with all the polarization that happened in this country. The goal is, how can we move up the hierarchy? Many people, I treat everybody the same, so they have cultural blindness. That's not really what we're looking for. We used to say we're the melting pot. We recognize now we're different, and each one of us can contribute tremendously to this country. So we cannot be culturally blind to what each one of us can bring in terms of richness to this country. So the key thing is, how can we be sensitized on the road to be more accepting and competent, and especially at an institutional level, whether it's the Tri-Faith Initiative or any organization, Creighton University, the School of Pharmacy where I teach and so on, and how our students can be sensitized. So that is really key. How can we move up the continuum? I think it all starts with ourselves, our self-identity, who we are, how do we identify ourselves, what percentage of our identity is part of the criteria. As you see, politics is 15% of who I am, my ethnicity and so on. All aspects, we need to identify who we are, and then clearly identify based on, I'm an Arab, a Palestinian, I'm a Muslim, I'm more secular than so on. I'm a he, his, him. So we need to do all of that in terms of who we are and so on. Very important. Sadly,
can I interrupt you to, I just want to make sure that I'm watching time.
Sure.
I want you to be able to I think we've spoken a lot about identity, and I at Tri-Faith, we could not agree more. And I think we need to continue to give people opportunity to do these exercises. So thank you for bringing that forward. I want to bring Abdul's question forward because it's very specific to the section prior, which is, can you talk a little bit about the lives of Palestinian and Arabs who hold Israeli citizenships and the difference of acceptance as those opposed to those who are living in the West Bank and Gaza?
Thank you. I didn't kind of touch base on that, but Arabs that hold Israeli citizenship are considered second-class citizenship. Yes, they have the Israeli nationality. Yes, they have representation, but they're denied many, many rights that Jewish Israelis have. So many of them still consider themselves Palestinians, but many of them, yes, still recognize, that they are part of the state of Israel. So in terms of really rights, in terms of permits to build and control of their daily life, they are exposed to many of the aspects that Palestinians live in the West Bank and the Gaza. Sadly, they've been killed and so on for protesting in support of Palestinians. What happened with the latest Gaza assault, you saw that the Palestinians in 1948 and beyond till 67, they showed their support of what is happening in terms of against the Palestinians in Gaza. And many people around the world, in fact, that whole war kind of changed the narrative in terms of what's happening in Palestine and in Gaza. So, that's a whole kind of story, but many people do consider that even though, yes, they're considered as Israeli citizens, they are denied many of the rights, and they're targeted in many different ways, whether they're protesting and so on, as compared to what happened with Jewish Israelis and so on.
Thank you. Jean,
May
we will
I just real quick,
please.
Wendy, in terms of a model or a framework, and I think that is really critical, whether we want cultural proficiency at different levels, including being a tri-faith member and so on. This is a model, and I would encourage you to look at her work. Campina Picotti is a nursing professor, but it applies to everything in life. If you really need to be culturally competent in any issue, for us, it's about health and so on, you need to have awareness, you need to have knowledge, and you need to have skills, and you need to engage yourself, encounter yourself with the other, regardless who that other is. You cannot do that without having the desire. She compares that to a volcano. Once that volcano erupts, you're gonna try really hard to understand the other from their perspective and who they are. So very important, that cultural desire. But more importantly, and that's what I added, you really have to have the lifelong learning. You cannot just assume by doing this that that's it, I know everything about the other, my patient population that are dealing with. And above that, you need to exhibit the cultural humility when you're dealing with that other. So you recognize that you might have not all the knowledge, you might make mistakes, you might actually have not the scope of actions and so on that you need to deal with the other. So a beautiful, beautiful model. With that, this is really when you're dealing with the other. I would have questioned you, what do you think the L stands for? Hopefully you recognize to listen to the other, so that your ears, your eyes, your whole nonverbal is really paying attention to the other. The E, you explain your point to the patient, to the other, so that they understand where you're coming from. Then you need to acknowledge what the other is telling you. So critical to acknowledge what they're saying. Then you could tell them, hey, I'm recommending this drug or this treatment, or I'm kind of based on what you told me, this is what I'm thinking. But the last thing, and that's what's needed really, an honest negotiation, whether it's a pharmacist, a nurse, a doctor, or Palestine, Israel, we need to negotiate in good faith. And that's the most difficult thing. And where is the balancing act so that we all agree on the way to move forward? So in terms of a model, the Campina Picotti model hopefully is an important one. The LEARN model, listening, explaining, acknowledging. There are many other frameworks and models, but the LEARN model is one thing I strongly believe in, and I hope, I really wanted to bring that up before we finish. My apologies. Go ahead.
You're great. No surprise, we didn't finish anything today. We just,
I hope we did accomplish many things.
I do think that we accomplished a lot. I think that it's so important to me to learn how to sit with the pain of someone who is other to me, and to realize that we as a society are really struggling on learning how to even attend to our own pain, let alone how to attend to the pain of others. And so moments like today that you so openly were vulnerable and shared with us are so appreciated by the Tri-Faith community. Thank you so much to everyone for showing up and listening today. And I hope that we can continue these kinds of conversations to get to know each other more intentionally and more deeply, and with love as the thing that we let trump all else. So we'd love to have your feedback. We do stay to a close hour here, so we've reached the hour. Thank you again, Naser. Thank you all for coming, and I hope that you give us some feedback in that link that I just shared. Take care, everyone.
Well, Wendy, thank you very much. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.